campaigns like the Bernie campaign or Warren's campaign using the rhetoric of exigency to drive people to the polls and then turn around and say, we're going to endorse Joe Biden because he's better than the alternative is frankly very dangerous. If better than the alternative still puts us in climate catastrophe, I think it has a deflating effect.
There are a lot of groups that think that perhaps nonviolent direct action is too extreme, or just think, or are trying to take the more sort of so-called pragmatic approach. And I guess in my mind, they don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. Like, you can go ahead and vote for Biden and you can get in the street.
When you know that they're taking us to this catastrophe, that's where the despair comes from. So when you break through those social norms in the form of nonviolent civil disobedience, it just feels wonderful.
We've really reached that urgency point, like the asteroid is headed for Earth, and the clock is ticking down.
Welcome to Bad Faith. We have returning to the podcast, Peter Kalmus, and for not only her first Bad Faith appearance, but her first podcast appearance ever, Rose Abramoff. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having us, Briahna.
So you two are here because you're both climate scientists and activists. And the last time you were on, Peter, I think I said, I don't know that I want to do another climate episode where it's just a bunch of people that show up and talk about how doom and gloom and horrible the newest IPCC report is, and how no one's doing anything, and how Biden sucks and all of this, because it's important to say, but we know it, and we've said it a bunch of times, and I feel like it's dispiriting to people. And the obvious conclusion to all of this, from my perspective, is that we have to put more emphasis on certain kinds of activism and disruption, potentially those that are a level of civil disobedience that gets people in all kinds of good trouble. And I saw a tweet from you recently, Peter, that said something to the effect of, hey, DM me if you're willing to get arrested.
Mm-hmm. Basically.
So tell me more about that and what you two have been up to.
If you're willing to risk arrest, we should make that distinction.
Sure.
So there's this group called Scientist Rebellion, and I've kind of loosely been a member of it for about a year. I did a hunger strike with them last year for 3 days. I didn't eat, which maybe doesn't sound that hard, but it was incredibly hard. And I don't know, what was it, Rose, like about a month before the IPCC report came out, 6 weeks or something, there was this kind of call that 2 days after the IPCC report came out, so Wednesday, April 6th, we were going to do a kind of global scientist rebellion. So I was like, all right, it's time to do this. Let's do this. So I reached out to some of my friends at Extinction Rebellion Los Angeles, and we came up with an action and we went for it. And so I did get arrested on Wednesday, April 6th in front of the JP Morgan Chase building in downtown Los Angeles. And I was charged with trespassing. I spent 8 hours in custody, was released from jail shortly after midnight that night. And here I am on your podcast.
So tell me more about that. Why the choice to protest in front of JP Morgan?
So we chose, in Los Angeles, we chose JP Morgan because out of all the institutions on the planet, this bank does more to finance new fossil fuel infrastructure than anyone else. And so they're literally financing the death of our collective future, and that's got to stop. I call what they're doing, what they're contributing to, neocide, which is the systematic mass murder of young people and future generations. So it's maybe a new word, but genocide didn't seem to quite cover this. And it sounds like a strong word, but I don't think it is, because for decades and decades, scientists have been telling what is going to come if we continue burning fossil fuels. And despite that clear warning for decades, and it's gotten clearer and clearer over time, the fossil fuel industry and those who finance the fossil fuel industry have lied, they've delayed action, they've known exactly what's coming, and yet they've still put their own personal profits above the collective fate of humanity and the entire planet. It sounds insane because it actually is insane.
Yeah, it's funny about JP Morgan too, because of all of the banks, I feel like they've done the most to brand themselves as, the best of the banks, the good guy. I remember once complaining about Jamie Dimon in the course of the Bernie campaign. We had done a little video talking about corporate greed or something. And some friend of mine from school or law school, I forget which, was like, I can't believe we're going after Jamie Dimon. He's like the nicest one. And I was like, oh boy. The gap between me and my peers is growing. And I feel like these banks, they do so much to give money to the right groups and put the BLM signs in their windows and really paint themselves as, curbing investments from all of these kinds of harmful industries. But you're saying that all of that is just window dressing, just like the BLM signs.
I think they just do that because they think it'll be better for their bottom line in their quarterly reports. And it's just that's as deep as it goes.
Yeah. So Rose, can you tell me a little bit about how you got involved in this activism work?
Sure. So, like Peter, I came to see Scientist Rebellion as an organization that was really doing interesting stuff with an emphasis on nonviolent direct action. So the stuff you were saying in the introduction, we're doing that now. So I think they first came to my attention in November of 2021 last year when I forget, a decent handful of scientists got arrested in Glasgow, Scotland, during the Conference of Parties, when, all the nations get together and try and come up with climate pledges. And Glasgow is kind of a major failure of escalation in climate pledges to try and mitigate climate change to a reasonable warming level. And so there was a lot of protest. And there was a civil disobedience action by scientists. And so I heard about that and I thought, that's really powerful because the public generally looks to scientists as authority figures. We study this and we understand the true implications of the things that we're studying. And so who better to sort of sound the alarm and try and make apparent that this is a serious, urgent crisis. And on the other side, I feel like if people see scientists not doing those things, if they see us just calmly, writing our papers and turning in our reports, and tweeting, they're just going to think, well, this can't be that serious. You guys are chilling. So I'm going to go ahead and ignore this issue.
That's such an important point. I very strongly believe that the gap between the rhetoric and action is extremely dangerous. I think that, frankly, campaigns like the Bernie campaign or Warren's campaign using the rhetoric of exigency to drive people to the polls and then turn around and say, well, we're going to endorse Joe Biden because he's better than the alternative is frankly very dangerous. If better than the alternative still puts us in climate catastrophe, I think it has a deflating effect. And so I want to ask you a little bit more, Rose, about what it is that you study in your background. Peter's been on the show before and the audience is more familiar with him. But I also want you to unpack a little bit about what we talked about before we started recording, which is that, you can't really specifically talk about your professional affiliations because you've been advised not to do so because of the kind of activism work that you're getting into.
Sure. Let me start with the first thing. So I'm a plant and soil scientist. I started out as a forest ecologist studying how much carbon dioxide gets taken up by plants and transported below ground into roots and soil and sort of the timing of that and the magnitude of that. And now I spend a lot of time doing simulation modeling, essentially using small pieces of those models that are in the IPCC report, projecting what's going to happen into the future. I work on small components of that, basically looking at how much carbon can get sequestered in the soil, how warming affects the carbon cycle of the land surface, and how land use change also affects land carbon cycling. So it's all super fun. There's a lot of math, which maybe isn't that fun for people, but it's fun for me. And then to address your second point, I think in general, there's this overarching paradigm of neutrality, and it's something that's been pounded into scientists at all levels of our training. We're told you have to remain neutral, and we get that messaging, technically it's just about our professional lives. When we're doing our science, we need to remain neutral and unbiased because that's the way you produce the best science, is by taking a critical eye to everything. But I feel like that has over time really bled over into also telling us that we need to remain neutral in our personal lives and sort of limiting our personal expression and making a lot of scientists feel like they have to maintain this level of neutrality across all things. And it really denies our humanity. It sort of denies us the ability to express the anxiety and frustration and fear that we're all definitely feeling. Like I have these water cooler conversations, the types of things that Peter's tweeting out to the world that seems like scary and alarmist, like we're having those conversations at the water cooler every day. It's just not making it out into the world.
See, I'm not negative. I'm just, I'm like a little window into what climate scientists are thinking and feeling. And the public's just not at that hasn't caught up yet. So I get all this criticism for being quote unquote negative when what I'm really doing is just fighting like hell for a livable planet.
Yeah, this is our locker room talk, basically.
Yeah. that is really some interesting perspective. So you're telling me that you guys go to your respective jobs, which you cannot talk about, and you face the reality of what the future is likely to look like. You, Rose, are looking at these soil samples and seeing, okay, it cannot absorb any more. This is how much carbon's going out. This is what the capacities are. This is what our land use predictions are going forward in the next 5, 10, 20, 25 years. And we're up Schitt's Creek. Sorry if that's overly simplistic. I'm not a climate scientist.
That's pretty good. You got the gist.
And you're like, oh my God, you are, well, at risk of leaning too much on pop culture references, you are the scientist in Get Up, Don't Look Up. There's a clip I actually want you to respond to because, you've obviously seen the movie, co-written by a friend of the show, David Sirota. But Mehdi Hassan on Peacock did an interesting side-by-side where he spliced together a recent interview of a climate scientist with the faux news scene from Don't Look Up.
Many people would agree that we have to wean ourselves off oil, but at the same time, they deeply resent having their personal lives massively interrupted.
How big is this thing? Could it destroy someone's house? Is that possible?
I don't think any of us want to be disrupting people's lives, but I think given the science and the things that academics are saying about what oil is causing around the world and in this country too, this is the level of action that needs to be taken.
It's somewhere between 6 and 9 kilometers across, so it's big. It would damage the entire planet, not just a house.
I wonder if any of you have read the latest IPCC reports that have come out this year. Yeah. What they have said is that we are on the road for climate catastrophe.
Well, as it's damaging, will it hit this one house in particular that's right on the coast of New Jersey? It's my ex-wife's house that needed to be hit.
And the clothes that you're wearing, to some extent, owe their existence to oil because they were taken in a car or a truck or a van to a shop,
I'm sorry, are we not being clear?
We're talking about crop failure by 2030. We're talking about people in this country right now in fuel poverty because of the prices of oil. And you're talking about the clothes that I'm wearing.
No.
We're trying to tell you that the entire planet is about to be destroyed.
Well, and for those who are planning to get away over the Easter holidays, could they expect more disruption, do you think?
There's something we do around here. We just keep the bad news light.
It's so amazing about Don't Look Up is that it's given us a shared language. Like, the LA Times did this crazy thing where they put like Earth on track to be, quote, unlivable in the little reefer on the bottom right of and it was like on page 3, right?
FYI.
And so I tweeted that out and like people can say things like that's like the most Don't Look Up thing ever, so or when, a young activist is on television in the UK and is getting slammed by the climate denying host, we can all recognize what's happening. And, and I think it speaks to the prescience of that film. I mean, when a lot of people, the critics were like, that's too on the nose, right?
Right.
But that was just their own climate denial speaking. And I thought it's fascinating how these like gatekeepers, these media gatekeepers, both in the news media and in the entertainment media, are deep in this climate denial and how much harder that makes it for people like us, for scientists, activists like us, to wake up the public. Because when the news media is like gaslighting us and making this really strong sort of, media world that basically doesn't include climate breakdown, then it makes it infinitely harder for us to break through because everyone will just think that we're quote unquote alarmist, right? Well, what we're really doing is just telling it straight.
What almost feels unrealistic is the idea that they would have gotten the meeting with the president in the first instance.
Yeah, I'm certainly not I'm expecting invitations to the White House anytime soon. I had an op-ed like a week and a half ago that was highly critical of the Biden administration. And interestingly, The Daily, the New York Times big podcast yesterday, they basically had a whole show which was exactly along the lines of my op-ed, which was interesting because usually they're not willing to be critical of the president like that. So
interesting. Do you recall any specifics of what they said?
Well, so the whole idea is basically that, the IPCC report says we can't build, and this is why we were protesting last week, right, and getting arrested. The IPCC report basically says we can't build any new fossil fuel infrastructure. What we have now is already going to take us well into catastrophe territory, right? And so when after Putin did his atrocious invasion of Ukraine, which we're all rightly denouncing because it's just absolutely horrifying. There were, deep implications for the energy supply, and so gas prices started going up, partly because the fucking CEOs are taking a bigger, and the shareholders are taking a bigger piece out of it. They're literally capitalizing, like increasing their capital on this disaster, right? And which is something we can talk about later, but I think that has to stop via policy. But anyway, because of that, what does the Biden administration do? First of all, they basically didn't mention climate at all in the State of the Union, right? I could sort of tell, like, the speechwriters were probably like, you probably should at least give it one mention. And then
so there's not an article about how they didn't mention it at all.
Right. And now they're like begging to expand fossil fuel production and like release the reserves, and even before the invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration was begging OPEC to expand, and they were approving more drilling permits than Trump did, right, in the same time frame. Yep. So it's just they're literally squandering one of the best moments we've ever had in history for educating the public and making the case for getting off of fossil fuels and doing a wartime huge push for renewables, right? So the Biden administration should be totally using the bully pulpit to do that, to educate the public. And instead, they're using the bully pulpit to just expand the fossil fuel industry and enrich these already filthy rich sociopathic fossil fuel CEOs. So they're using the bully pulpit to accelerate us further into climate catastrophe, even though they campaigned somewhat on taking climate action. So that's what my op-ed was about a couple weeks ago, and that's what the daily episode was about yesterday. And that's also why we were protesting.
Part of why I'm surprised to hear that the Daily did an episode on it is because I think a common, liberal attitude toward political critique is that if they don't perceive there to be an alternative in the bipartisan landscape of the liberal mind, then there's literally no point in saying anything negative about Joe Biden, because the other side is always going to be worse.
Right.
Like that's been my observation. So that you can sneak in some critique during a primary season or something when there's an alternative. But especially in like a midterm election year, we're looking at probably a struggle bus for Biden down the line 2 years from now. I'm surprised not that they would, that your article and the IPCC reports and all that stuff wouldn't break through, but that it would break through and actually come out as a sincere articulation of frustration with Joe Biden.
Yeah, I think it was pretty remarkable. I need to go back and listen to it much more carefully. I think they said some ameliorating things that I definitely didn't say in my op-ed. But yeah, basically that it was quite critical of the Biden administration. And this whole kind of, how did you phrase it? It was beautiful. The bipartisan landscape of the liberal brain, or something like that. This dynamic makes it very, very, it's another dynamic that makes up. So we got the media denial, right? And then we've got this like crazy sort of lesser of two evils dynamic. And both of those things make it extremely hard for we climate activists to actually do our job, which is to try to protect the fucking planet for all of us, right? Because so what makes it easier for me is to just have this view, which I feel very, very deeply, that I'm just a spokesperson for the Earth, right? This is physics. I'm representing the Earth. The Earth is crying out in pain right now. And it's saying, you are taking me, you're taking all of us, all of life on Earth, to a very, very bad place of death and suffering. It doesn't care about party politics in the US. And so, like, I don't want to be critical of the quote unquote good party, but if it's expanding fossil fuels even faster than the quote unquote bad party, we're equally dead either way. And I have a responsibility as a scientist to speak up. And yeah, I'm insulted and denigrated and ridiculed by the liberal sort of Democrats for saying that. I don't know what else to do. Like I don't see them as my enemy at all. I'm just doing my job and speaking for the earth.
I think one of the reasons why you see an escalation now, even though the good party, quote unquote, is in power, is because the scientific community at least is realizing how little time we have. I mean, we don't really have time to wait until to be like polite and wait until the next administration or another round of elections, because, we have between 2 and 3 years by our best estimate to peak fossil fuel emissions if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, which is, what our community generally thinks safer level. So it's, like we've really reached that urgency point, like the asteroid is headed for Earth, and the clock is ticking down.
Oh God, the media plays such a huge role in this, because if the media wasn't doing this climate denial thing and doing such a bad job of, letting the public know what an actual emergency this is, then the Biden administration wouldn't be able to keep doing this and like kowtowing to the fossil fuel industry, right? So it's really like that. It's like this kind of like this, I don't know, it's like a machine, and the media is part of it, and that allows the administration to keep expanding the fossil fuel industry. So I'm more and more, I really think that Don't Look Up was much more trenchant than most people realize. And I've spoken to Adam McKay, and I know that he also sees the media as playing a huge part in our society's sleepwalking towards climate destruction.
The media plays a huge role. But I'm curious, I know this is delicate because these are other movement actors I'm about to bring into this who I have been supportive of, and I want to thrive and be successful. The same way that you're saying, I'm not rooting against these liberals. I'm not certainly not rooting against a group like the Sunrise Movement. But I wonder what role you think that a group like that and an endorsement for Biden in the context of the primary, what kind of effect that has on the movement in conjunction with the media. Because of course the media can go and then say, they can go report on the fact that these progressive groups supported Joe Biden, and Joe Biden can be the climate choice. I had a now infamous disagreement with Noam Chomsky on an early episode of this show because he used the idea of climate threat as the ultimate bully pulpit for why he said that we should vote for Joe Biden. And I totally get that. I totally get it. People think that Donald Trump is an unreasonable threat and you want to vote blue no matter who. Like, I understand those arguments, and people are going to do what they're going to do. But I'm a little unsure about this idea of using climate as the bully pulpit or as the stick, when it's not clear to me that what Joe Biden is offering is meaningfully better, or at least doesn't get us to avoiding the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is so important in terms of it being a climate cliff with all of these trickle-down effects. Not trickle-down effects, enormous global effects. How do you see that? And how do you see the role of not just the media, but those kinds of lefty organizations and their relationship with liberal administrations that don't meet the moment?
I think there's a lot of people in this ecosystem, and everybody's trying to get to the same thing, and we just have different opinions about the most effective way to get there. So, there are a lot of groups that think that perhaps nonviolent direct action is too extreme, or are trying to take the more sort of so-called pragmatic approach. And I guess in my mind, they don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. Like, you can go ahead and vote for Biden and you can get in the street. And that has historically been my approach. But again, like, Peter probably has a lot more to say about it since he's thought more deeply about the politics side of this issue.
I guess that's my cue. So I see a lot of the kind of big, kind of environmental NGOs just co-opted, and they become part of the system of capitalism, where it's like kind of fundraising, and it sort of supports the status quo. And they're not always eager to see, once you get in this kind of comfortable position, right, with like a comfortable salary and like things are working for you. Unfortunately, oftentimes this means that you're sort of afraid to really shake things up. And I think things have to get completely shaken up. So I've seen all of this co-option. The other thing I will say is that I don't think that marching is enough anymore. I basically think marching doesn't really do anything. I could probably get in trouble for saying that, but I think it's like petitions. Like, they might make you feel good when you sign them, but they're not going to, they're politely asking the people in power to voluntarily make changes. And that we keep trying that over and over and over again, and it hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked for a reason. So there was this study, which is not well known, which I learned about by reading a book by Jason Hickel called Less is More. I think it was from 2012 or 2014. It was a Harvard-Yale study. And it was kind of sort of a sociology study where they took a bunch of people and they basically gave them this sort of like simulation where they got to choose whether they would use all of the resources for themselves and make maximum profit, and then there would be nothing for future generations, or if they would take they would leave enough. They would take enough for themselves to thrive, but they would leave enough for future generations. It turned out that 68% of people left enough, and 32% of people took everything for themselves, and they're like, fuck future generations. And so then they did another test where they had to make the subjects had to make the decision collectively. And lo and behold, everything was fine. It was sustainable. They only took what was able to be produced by the resources. They basically harvested at a sustainable rate, and they left enough for future generations because that 68% had the majority. Now, what I think happens in our society is that those 32% are basically the kind of people that just essentially want money and power, and they want everything for themselves, and they don't have a lot of kind of countervailing values. Like, they don't have a lot of empathy, they don't have a lot of compassion, they don't want a better future for their kids necessarily, or at least they view the way to do that is by hogging as much for themselves as possible. And if you were like that, you would naturally seek positions that gave you power and money. So I think there's a tendency in our society for those sorts of people who, I suppose, I don't, I'm not a clinician, but they sound sort of sociopathic to me. Those types of people are the ones that are naturally going to eventually take on those roles of money and power, those CEO roles and those politician roles, et cetera. And you get this kind of revolving door of power and money, which is sort of what we have right now. It's completely corrupted our politics. So, I think that they're not likely. So we have that kind of thought experiment, that sociology experiment. Then we also have decades of actual empirical evidence that despite knowing where we're heading, they're not voluntarily making the changes that we need. Part of which, and I mentioned this earlier in the discussion, part of which involves redistributing wealth towards the working class and poor households, and even across international lines to the poor people in the global South. And the reason that this is not just some kind of like progressive talking point is that look at gas prices right now. So there's a real problem, right, with just ramping down the fossil fuel supply if that's all you do, which is, but the reason that's a problem is because the price will skyrocket. And so then your fossil fuel capitalists will make more and more, and your working class households will be absolutely squeezed. Are they going to like that kind of policy, ramping down fossil fuels just with nothing else? No, they're going to do yellow jacket protests like they did in France. So you have to, when you're ramping on the fossil fuel industry, that has to absolutely come with policies that protect working class and poor households, right? So it's not optional. Like, you have to have a redistribution. You have to have price controls for working class households. And that's another reason why I think the rich people in power aren't going to voluntarily make these kinds of changes. Or if they do, they're going to do it in a way that ensures there's a popular uprising against climate action from the working class, which would be a disaster. So that's why I think that what Rose and I did last week, and many, many other scientists around the world, this climate civil disobedience is absolutely essential at this point, because it's what's actually powerful enough to start waking people up, even despite the climate denial of the mainstream media. And it's been absolutely fascinating how things have played out over the course of the last week since we got arrested.
Well, how have things played out? What has the media reaction been like?
There's been no mainstream national media coverage whatsoever. There's been coverage in venues, but they've been sort of like niche venues or local venues, right? No coverage in the New York Times. LA Times completely ignored it, even though one of the biggest events was here in Los Angeles. Boston Globe ignored it. USA Today ignored it, as far as I know. There's been nothing like CNN, MSNBC, are they covering this? I don't think so. So what did happen was word of mouth started getting out about what was happening, and people were so hopeful. So people have been feeling overwhelmed and hopeless, and all the positive messaging in the world, they're not stupid. They see what's happening to the planet, right? Even though the media is not reporting it, they get the rumbling overtones, coming through, and you can't just like message your way out of CO2 rising in the fucking atmosphere and 1.2 degrees Celsius of global heating and all the fires. And you can't message your way out of that. It's physical reality. It's happening on the planet. So what happened was a bunch of scientists risking arrest, instead of just staying in their ivory towers, gave people hope. And it started going viral on TikTok. It started going viral on Twitter. It started going viral on social media. And I've been getting messages from people everywhere just emailing me and telling me how grateful they are that we did this and how it's giving them hope. So what this has taught me is that this kind of civil disobedience, taking a risk as an activist. So when you tweet something, it's not taking a risk, come on. But like to take a real risk, that's the strongest form of communication from one human to another that you can do. And it's burrowing through these barriers that are in the mainstream media, and it's burrowing through the sort of despair and overwhelm and the kind of sort of emotional denial that puts people, even smart people who care, that they're in, because they just can't deal with it. And they're starting to feel hope. And the hope that I'm starting to feel now is that this movement grows and that more and more scientists and more people start to take this kind of risk and engage in civil disobedience. Because if thousands and thousands of people started to do this, I think it would genuinely change things, and we could get the social transformation that we've all been waiting for and hoping for.
So what is this going to look like? Because we have people on the show and we talk about this in a labor context, and what kinds of actions are likely to actually affect politicians because they obstruct supply chains, have downstream economic consequences for the people who care first and foremost about those things. I had a back and forth with Asher Taylor, the Debt Collective, about the utility of a debt strike, given that that is not money that anybody needs. It's debt that's already in non-payment status, and strategically thinking about where the best places are to put pressure. From your perspective, what do you hope future nonviolent climate action looks like? Are we talking about more events like the ones on April 6th? Are we talking about tying ourselves to redwoods? Are we talking about doing civil disobedience at pipeline construction sites? What is this looking like?
So I think there are a lot of different types of tactics. So for example, the action that I did wasn't at a bank. I did good old fashioned chaining myself to the fence of the White House. And then a couple of days later, I participated in a roadblock.
Which was like the most punk thing ever, Rose, by the way.
Oh, yeah. I went ahead and, I wanted to support the organizations that were supporting me, which are Declare Emergency based in D.C., Camp McGeezy, and Honor the Earth, which are two indigenous, like water protection and indigenous rights organizations based out of Minnesota. And just like show solidarity with them, because even though we're scientists and we tend to get more media attention, I do really feel like everybody deserves a voice, and it's a little bit sad that like we have to swoop in and like lend credibility to these people who get written off as kooks all the time. But anyway, to go back to tactics, I think there are a lot of different types of tactics, and maybe some generate more media attention, and maybe some are more disruptive, and maybe some target specific types of infrastructure or specific types of corporations. But I think the most important thing that they have in common is that they remain nonviolent. And really tap into this historical legacy of nonviolent direct action, because it really has been shown to be kind of one of the more effective ways of protesting. Well, it's not even protesting, it's an effective form of resistance and generating political action. I don't know if on the show you've ever talked about the work of Erica Chenoweth and how, according to her research, that you only need like 3.5%. She came up with this number by looking at the historical legacy, right, of the population mobilized in order to make political change. And I think there's something much more powerful about nonviolent direct action as opposed to just any type of mobilization, because, I mean, let's think about all of the successful campaigns we've had in our, not even our history, but in the history of the world, like Gandhi, the suffragettes, South African apartheid, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Freedom Riders, like those were all centered around nonviolent direct action as a strategy. And seeing that risk, like not being able to accuse us of taking our paychecks in our ivory towers, like really mobilizes people. And it sucks for us because it means we have to risk. But I think it really is the most effective way.
We need a diversity of tactics, lots of different tactics. And what the civil disobedience action isn't necessarily the most important thing. There's a lot of different things people can do. They need to try to think strategically. And they also have to, I think what's more important maybe is taking a risk, right? So if you're in a position where you can take a risk, you do that soul searching, you weigh what's happening to our planet against the other things that you care about, like your career, for example, and you decide that it's worth the risk. That sense of risk, that pushing yourself and the butterflies in your stomach, that's critical. Because if you don't feel like you're taking a risk, if you're still just staying in your comfort zone, then you're not pushing against social boundaries. We're incredibly sensitive instruments at reading the social room, so to speak, right? Second, I would say that the most important thing is that we just get large numbers of people engaging in this kinds of civil disobedience. I think there's a chance that whether we end up saving what can still be saved, or we end up into this incredibly horrific, dystopian, hot and deadly future, could depend on whether this sort of movement stays just like a handful of scientists, or whether it breaks into the mainstream and we start seeing this happening thousands and thousands of times over. So I'd say it's the two kind of rules of thumb here are taking risks as an activist and just growing the numbers, getting more and more numbers.
One thing that I think is really powerful about this movement specifically is that Scientist Rebellion in the US, it's just a handful of people, as Peter said, but there are country level groups all over the world. So on April 6th, there were hundreds of scientists in over 25 countries participating in some type of civil disobedience. Not all of them were risking arrest, because in some countries, with some governments, that's absolutely not safe at all. And so people were really like assessing the needs of their own particular location, like crafting a type of direct action that meets their local needs, but acting in coordination, like in solidarity. And I think that was really powerful.
Well said.
Yeah. So it seems to me, I remember there was some reporting, I was going to say a lot, but that's overstating the extent to which there's ever reporting on these kinds of things, of a number of climate scientists, one woman in particular who was slapped with an disproportionately outrageous sentence for doing climate activism. Jessica, do you know what I'm talking about? Jessica
Reznicek.
Reznicek.
Yeah,
exactly.
in Iowa. So she was taking direct action. She was doing actually nonviolent fossil fuel sabotage, which is the next, another level above what we were doing. But yeah, she was feeling desperate, and so she started to take these sabotage direct actions, completely nonviolent and coming from a deep spiritual place. So actually part of her faith as a Catholic, so it was part of the Catholic workers movement, which has a long history, actually a long and rich history. So yeah, so out of love and out of a sense of putting her body in between this planetary destruction and the young people and the future generations and all of life on Earth. So an incredibly generous, compassionate act. And she did damage fossil fuel property. And she was punished. Well, I think she got a sentence of 8 years in prison, didn't she? And she was like basically labeled as a terrorist. So, yeah.
And there have been laws, an effort to pass laws that increase the penalty for people who do take that approach and do nonviolent property damage. And I wanted to ask you, as you were describing, the benefits of a nonviolent approach, to what extent you're including property damage or sabotage like that. It might be even like digital kinds of sabotage, whatever it is, in that category of nonviolent intervention.
So that's a really good question. I think that's right at the forefront of what the movement is discussing right now. And so there's a lot of disagreement on that. So my personal view right now is that the fossil fuel industry is doing irreversible violence and damage to our planet, to its life support systems. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. And I think that if we stay on this current course, there could easily be billions of human deaths as a result of this buildup of greenhouse gases, primarily as a result of this buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and global heating and all the impacts that it causes. So if you see, if you intervene when, somebody is beating up a child or something, and you have to use some force to pull that person off and kind of restrain them, is that violence? Or are you intervening out of love and compassion for sort of the greater good and stopping something really bad from happening? So I would say that, I would like to see maybe this kind of this word nonviolence and this concept of nonviolence maybe be expanded a little bit, because to merely cause property damage, if it doesn't harm any human at all and it potentially protects billions of humans, that does not seem like violence to me. It seems like intervening against a huge amount of violence out of love and compassion and at great personal risk.
It's probably important to clarify to your viewers at this point the difference between nonviolence and not being violent, because they are very different things. So not being violent is not being violent as interpreted, but nonviolence really refers to the fact of creating a tension between you and the system against which you're fighting that does not rise to the level of violence. And we can discuss that definition, but like creates a tension, like a rubber band that's not too loose and not too tight, right?
And obviously there are people who perceive property damage to be violence. When we hear a lot of the conservative reaction to Black Lives Matter protests, et cetera, and they talk about them being violent, they are talking about property destruction. And there is a pendulum swing in terms of popular opinion that often turns on whether or not a protest has turned into something that is involving property damage. It is also true, however, and people love to forget this reality, that after George Floyd's murder, when the Minneapolis police station was burned down, the immediate response from polls across the country, including all of these, not especially radical liberals, was positive. It had like 60+% support because people felt like it was commensurate with a tragedy that they had just witnessed on their phones and computers,
I think it's also important to point out that in the value system of this capitalist system that we live in, property is valued above human life.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of why we're here. I mean, look at the genocide of indigenous peoples that was, and the slavery and genocide of Black peoples that was basically the foundation of this country that we live in today. And that's, again, it's crazy to have to phrase it that way, but it's not.
It's not even crazy at all.
It's not even a little bit crazy. It's not even a little bit exaggerating the reality, right? And so here we are in this system that is like this and that values the property, especially of the rich, more than life of humans, of poor humans, and more than life like non-human life too, which all of humans depend on for our life, right? Because it's a web of life. Like we can't just continue conquesting it and dominating it, dominion over all that crawls on the land and swims in the ocean, right? That's getting us into a very, very dangerous place of ecological collapse. So yeah, I don't. If you do a thought experiment of someone, living in 2070, imagine that humans make all the wrong decisions, and we get to 4 degrees Celsius of global heating, and civilization breaks down, and it's this horrible, it's the worst possible post-apocalyptic movie that you can imagine. The people that remain would probably be dreaming of a chance to come back in time and do a little bit of get into, maybe a little bit of what I'd call nonviolent fossil fuel sabotage. So that's a thought experiment.
Yeah, it's the climate equivalent of would you go back and kill baby Hitler, except you literally don't even have to kill baby Hitler. You just have to break his playpen.
Yeah. So I don't really know what the answer there is. There's a group in a recent novel by Kim Stanley Robinson called Ministry for the Future, and the group is called Children of Kali. And there's a heat wave in central India in the first chapter of the book, in which millions and millions of people die, like one heat wave. And it sparks this movement where they start, sabotaging. They're actually not interested in nonviolence in any way you might define it, but they're very angry at people flying in private jets, for example, and other things of that nature.
Well, I know this is spicy. So let me bring us back down to kind of where we are right now. I know a lot of people who listen to this podcast are tired of electoral solutions. They're looking to do a lot more direct action. And I think they're very excited about the prospect of having that tingle in their gut and doing some of the protest work that you've done recently. So to direct them, where should they go? Is it Extinction Rebellion? What should they do? What links should we put in the episode description so that people can go and join this kind of a movement?
Before we do that logistics, I'm really, really glad you brought that up, because I did want to say, just in kind of closing, that having done that action and risked arrest, it feels amazing. Like, I feel so kind of much more free and just like much more empowered and much more kind of connected to all of my brothers and sisters in this movement. And it is the best antidote to climate despair that I can imagine. So I'd like to write a prescription for everyone out there to experience this like wonderful, profound spiritual feeling of engaging in this kind of action, this liberating feeling, and to really just dig deep and remember, like, this is all just a construct, the social norms that we have. Like, you're trapped by, you're basically imprisoned by them, right? And when you know that they're taking us to this catastrophe, that's where the despair comes from. So when you break through those social norms in the form of nonviolent civil disobedience, it just feels wonderful. And so I hope anyone who's able to do that, in a position to do that, does start to experience it. And the way you do that is by joining with other people, especially people that are already experienced.
Yeah, I would
Go ahead.
just qualify that a tiny bit by saying jail was not my favorite thing in the world, but nothing beats, I mean, therapy is good, and I think I tweeted something to this effect, but like nothing calms you and like subdues despair than the feeling of taking action. So I totally agree with that. And if people want to join up with Scientist Rebellion, you can identify as a scientist, self-identify, or you can play a support role. That's also fine.
I was a history of science major. Can I be a scientist?
Absolutely. 100%. I've got a lab coat in my apartment for you.
Love it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really about self-identification. And we have a lot of support roles available. But you can also choose any one of the sister organizations that share the same broad goals. I think it doesn't really matter. So like choose whatever works for you and join up.
Is there something that you wish people, if it had been covered appropriately, the April 6th action, is there something that people should know about it, or something about it that they should be amplifying, even on social media, as they're working their way up to doing direct action?
I would say the most important thing, and Rose might disagree with this, and it's probably not necessary, but for me, sort of like, and this will sound maybe a little bit hokey, but actually treating it from the very beginning as kind of like a spiritual practice was extremely important to me. And to try to do it out of a sense of selflessness, and on behalf of the earth and for my kids and for young people everywhere, so that it's not about me. That brings a certain sort of courage, right? Just from knowing that you're doing this on behalf of others. Then I don't know why exactly that gives courage. There's something about the practice that I do, which is about kind of realizing that there really isn't kind of a self at all. Like, it's just this flux and this flow of kind of changing thoughts and rapidly changing vibrating atoms in your body, right? That you're like this kind of like fold of the universe that's existing for a short period of time. And that the sort of moral kind of responsibility and sacred duty to stand up for the earth right now it's just deeply, deeply meaningful. And I guess it makes it a lot easier to do these kinds of actions.
Yeah, I don't think it's an accident that among some of the major left commentators, the ones that really seem to resonate with people are folks like Chris Hedges, who comes from a spiritual tradition, so has a theological background. People like Cornel West, who often integrate.
Tim DeChristopher is another one. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that people are really craving that. Even, like Marianne Williamson, there is a cohort that will roll their eyes, but I do think there is a real appetite for something that borders on the spiritual, even if it's not, explicitly religious, because people do feel so disconnected. And I was reflecting on this recently, this whole kind of conservative ideology and the focus on individualism as almost a moral principle. And I was in a debate recently with Coleman Hughes, and he was asking me, isn't it good to be an individual? And we're talking about identity politics and stuff. And I was making the case that the reason we advocate for, to end bigotry and systemic racism is because people don't have the right to be individuals when we're assumed to be, seen first as something else. But also I was thinking afterward about how, if I'm going to be really honest, I just don't fundamentally value individuality as a kind of moral quantity the way that he obviously does. I want people to be free, but I also see a lot of value in communal living and interpersonal relationships and supporting each other's society and maximizing our collective benefit. And maybe that makes me sound like a big communist or something. Yeah, go ahead, Rose.
No, and I think that's exactly what this community is about. And I think to restate what Peter was saying in more secular terms, the most important thing about this movement to me was sort of joining the existing community that's already been built around this movement. There are already, our children, like our indigenous and activists from all over the world have been lobbying for climate change mitigation for years. And I felt like this is a bit of a dismantling of the identity of scientists. We've spent so much time sequestered away in this special role and not integrated with humanity and supporting them and joining them. And I just felt this deep satisfaction of taking this identity of scientist and melting it back into the people,
Yeah.
Beautiful. I think that's definitely secular, but I would also say at the same time that's spiritual.
Yeah.
So just
I got
that
a
sense.
chill, I gotta say.
Exactly.
I appreciate both of you coming. If either of you want to drop your, where people can find you and your work on social media or elsewhere, please feel free to do so.
Sure. I'm Climate Human on Twitter and now on TikTok as well. And people can also go to scientistrebellion.com if they want to learn more about the international movement.
Terrific. And Rose?
So Scientist Rebellion's Twitter is @ScientistRebel1. I don't know. And my Twitter is UltraCricket.
Terrific. I hope there's a huge boost to following on all of these media platforms and also people signing up to participate after this episode comes out. I want to thank both of you so much for being so generous with your time. And to all our listeners, a reminder that this podcast comes out twice a week on Mondays and on Thursdays. Monday is the premium episode, and you can get it by subscribing at $5 a month on patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. It enables us to keep producing all of this independent media content, or you can listen to the free Thursday episodes. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. And as always, take care of yourself and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.